All right, hello everybody, and welcome back to the channel. This is National Master Dave Mohan, and it's been a while since I last uploaded a video, but I'm hoping to pick up right where we left off with a chess strategy video. So today we're going to be talking about a very important topic in chess, and this is whether you're a beginner or a master, and it's seizing the initiative. So basically taking those critical moments in chess and using them to your advantage by taking the initiative that you're given by your opponent. And the best way I thought I would be able to talk about this concept is by showing one of the games that I recently played. So let's dive right into it. So it starts with d4 and I play f5. Those who know me know that I love the Dutch defense, and that's what this is, one f5. But the opening here is not too critical. It's actually the middle game that matters, so we'll skip forward a bit. My opponent goes for this knight c3 setup with bishop to g5, and here I play knight to c6. So if you're a beginner and you're thinking, what is this opening? Don't worry. The main point of this video is not the first couple moves, but this is indeed what I play. It's kind of weird. So I go knight to e5 here, takes. Again, we're not going to worry too much about this. Queen to d2, knight to f6, and f4. And here I would argue is the first critical moment where a decision needs to be made. So here my opponent plays f4, attacking my bishop here on e5. Now I have two main choices at this point. Either I can take the knight with my bishop, trading pieces, or I can drop back bishop to d6. In the game, I ended up choosing bishop to d6, preserving my bishop. And this is for two reasons. One, in chess, there's this thing called the bishop pair. People who are a little more advanced might know what the bishop pair is. Maybe the fact that Bobby Fischer and other greats of chess have preferred bishops over knights. But the other reason is if I went bishop takes c3 here, and my opponent played queen takes c3, not only would I be losing the bishop pair, but my knight would be pinned to my rook. So here I wouldn't be able to play a move like knight takes d5 or knight to e4, forking the queen and the bishop, getting my bishop pair back, because my rook on h8 would simply be hanging. So here I go bishop to d6. Now my opponent takes, I recapture with the pawn, and knight to b5. So the purpose of knight b5 is to attack my bishop on d6. If I allow my opponent to take my bishop, then I have to take back with the c-pawn. So let's say a6, takes. Now I'll have these really ugly double isolated d-pawns, neither of which can move because of my opponent's strong pawn on d5. So I didn't want this compromised pawn structure. So instead, after knight b5, I go bishop to c5. And this bishop is a really good piece, especially because my opponent doesn't have his dark square bishop. So just to illustrate the potential power of this bishop, let's say my opponent castles queenside. I go a6, attacking the knight. My opponent comes back. I go queen to e7. My opponent goes g3, trying to open up a square for the bishop. And now bishop to e3 pins the queen to the white king. The queen protects the bishop. And because white has no dark square bishop, these dark squares are especially weak, and my bishop can win the queen in this position. So that's just one possible way in which the bishop on c5 can be a very powerful piece, taking advantage of the dark squares. But here my opponent does something very interesting. He goes d6, and he basically says, before I give you a chance to make this bishop of yours very good, I'm going to try and cause complications. And now my opponent's already threatening knight takes c7, which would be a fork on my king and my rook. So here I just take, my opponent takes, and we're nearing the more critical part of the game, king to e7. Now I've got two attackers on the knight. He castles queenside, adding another defender to this knight. The rook on d1 now defends the knight. And now queen to c7, adding yet another attacker to the knight. So now we see a trade takes, and pawn to e3. Now I play the move pawn to d5, and this is a powerful move for two reasons. The first is that we're stopping the white bishop from developing to a very natural square. The bishop would ideally like to come to c4, it would be strong there, but the pawn on d5 prevents this. And the second reason is this pawn is taking space in the center, and it's completely untouchable, because if you take, now I'll go bishop takes e3 check, and if the white king moves, I have queen takes c2, king to a1, and queen to c1 with mate to follow. Rook takes and rook takes. So this is not a viable option for white. After bishop to e3, if rook to d2, I'll give you guys a chance to find the mate. Pause your videos and find the mate. But simple enough, we have queen takes c2. And this is checkmate. So this d5 pawn is completely untouchable, which is why white goes king to b1, stepping out of these bishop takes e3 check tricks. So now I go rook to d8, protecting the pawn. Bishop to d3, queen to b6, pawn to c3, and now king to f7. So I'm kind of glazing over these moves because they're somewhat normal. White is just getting the king safe, ensuring the safety of the king, pushing c3 so that this queen defends the pawn. Rook to e1, and now a5. So basically my idea with a5, this is another critical moment of the game, is I want to get an attack going somehow. And the best way I'm going to do that is to leverage the dark square advantages that I have here, or more accurately, the dark square weaknesses that white has. So by playing a5, I'm trying to push this pawn all the way down the board and hit these weak dark squares near the opponent king. So a5, now my opponent goes h3, and I go a4. I simply proceed. King to a1, and now a3. So just staying consistent with my plan, pushing this pawn all the way down the board. Now my opponent finally plays b4, and I'd like you guys to take a second to think about where you'd put this bishop. So just to give a brief bit of context, when I work with players as a coach, because I also coach chess, when I work with players as a coach, a lot of the time they don't like retreating their pieces all the way back. So for example, in this position, one would prefer bishop e7 over something like bishop to f8, just because you're not retreating as much. However, this is pretty flawed in terms of ways of thinking, because sometimes retreating further can give you more options, and indeed it does in this position. So here I choose bishop to f8, and bishop f8 is the best retreat, because now, although we're retreating more, we create this other option for ourselves on this diagonal. Whereas if we had gone bishop to e7, we'd be blocked in by our own pawn, and we wouldn't have this extra option of going to the other diagonal. So bishop f8 was my choice, and after g4, I decide to take, and here comes pretty much the last critical moment of the game, and one that I wanted to focus on for a bit. So in chess, sometimes you only get one chance to prove your advantage. You can be slightly better in a position, but you can still only get one chance, one move, to really make things happen, and I think this was really the case here. If my opponent gets a chance on the next turn, let's say I go bishop to g7, now he could even play pawn to f5, and it's not looking like this bishop is going to have a very easy time seeing the light of day. In fact, if we wanted to make use of our bishop, we'd have to reroute all the way bishop f8, bishop d6, bishop e5. But instead, here black has to find a move that takes advantage of his greatest asset in the position, which is the dark square attack. So if we want to attack on these dark squares, for example, the weak c3 pawn, the weak b4 pawn, what would you try to do in this position? So I'll give you guys a second to think about it. Feel free to pause your video and try to brainstorm what can we do to take advantage of the weaknesses on white's dark squares on the queen side. All right, I'll go ahead and spoil it. So in the game, I played f5 here. And f5 looks a little bit crazy because you're basically giving up a kingside pawn for free, and as it is, the black king is not very safe. But after g takes f5, now we go bishop to g7, and I hope you guys notice the difference between these two move orders. If we go bishop to g7 first, like I was saying, white can shut down this bishop's diagonal, our own pawn is blocking us. However, if we go f5 first and then bishop to g7, we've already cleared the way for our bishop, and this attack is going to be lethal. Just looking at the rook and the bishop both staring down this pawn, we can already clearly see trouble here for white. So white goes pawn takes g6, pawn takes g6, and now after rook to c1, I go queen takes b4, and we can see the power of this bishop on g7 just laying there. The black queen cannot be taken because of the pin on the king. And already black has tons of threats. We've got 1, 2, 3 attackers on the c3 pawn. And currently white only has 2 defenders and cannot add another. So here white goes bishop takes g6 check. And not wanting to mess around, I just go king to f8. And there are no more checks in this position. White goes queen to d3 here, trying to create some sort of mating threats with queen to f5. But here it's already too little too late because black has mate in 1 with queen to b2. Now I think it's fun to, so this is what happened in the game, but I think it's fun to look at rook to b1. Because after rook b1, black can actually go rook takes c3, rook takes b4, and if you guys can find the mate in 1 here, go ahead and try. But because of this killer bishop on g7, we've got rook to c1, double checkmate. And especially if you're a beginner, I'd recommend looking at this position, maybe even rewinding the video a little bit, because this sort of checkmate is a very interesting one and can pop up in your games. This sort of discovery double checkmate, and is a very useful tactic to have in your back pocket. All right, so this concludes the chess strategy video on initiative. I hope you guys took something away from this video, and if you did, please go ahead and like and subscribe. I do plan on getting back to regular posting, so you can look forward to more new videos soon. Until then, peace out. I'll see you guys in the next